Welcome to Moonlit Romantic, a place where love stories bloom in the quiet of night to carry you softly into dreams. Tonight's story is The Enchanted Garden. When Eleanor Hart inherits her great-aunt's crumbling estate, she expects leaky roofs and broken furniture. What she doesn't expect is a forgotten walled garden, locked away and tangled, whispered about in the village as enchanted, as Eleanor begins to restore the wild beauty within its walls. She discovers a garden that answers to love, and a quiet man, Gabriel Linden, who seems to know its secrets. Together, among ivy, roses, and impossible blooms, they will learn that some places grow more than flowers. They grow hope. They grow healing. And sometimes, if the heart is ready, they grow love. So settle in, let the night be kind, and let the story begin. Chapter 1. The Inheritance. Eleanor Hart first saw the house through a veil of rain, as if the countryside were reluctant to let her look too quickly. The lane wound past hedgerows and sleepy fields, a ribbon of wet stone bordered by cow parsley left to brown with the season. She had been told the estate sat on the edge of the parish, where the hills considered becoming forest and then changed their mind. She had imagined a tidy manor in miniature, square windows, polite chimneys, a garden that did not argue. Instead, what rose from the mist was a ramble of gables and slate, a house that had grown the way a story grows. By listening to what came before and adding what felt right at the time, she parked beside a leaning carriage house and turned off the engine. The rain softened to a whisper. For a moment, she sat with both hands resting on the steering wheel, as if the car might tell her what to do next. She had spent the long drive listing practicalities in her head. Check the roof, call a roofer, find a plumber, brave enough for old pipes, write to the solicitor, meet the gardener if there was one, organize a skip for broken furniture. She had repeated these tasks like a prayer. Against uncertainty. They were anchors. They were measurable. But lists did not explain the tug she felt as she stepped out into the cool, leaf-scented air and faced the home of the great aunt who had loved her with tender oddity and long letters, and who had now impossibly left her this place. Aunt Matilda's handwriting had covered decades of holidays and minor triumphs. "You must come in spring one year," she had written once. "The orchard forgets itself and becomes a wedding." Eleanor climbed the worn stone steps and found the front door key where the solicitor had said it would be, tucked in a rusted tin under the third pot of rosemary. The key was larger than it needed to be the kind of key that had opinions about history. It turned with a reluctant groan. The door yielded a breath of air, like forgotten cedar, dust, and something cinnamon sweet that made her think of tea and wool blankets. "Hello," she said to the empty hall because Aunt Matilda would have approved. "The house," answered with a tiny settle of timbers, a sigh of floorboards, and a clock somewhere ticking with an extravagant patience. Inside, wallpapers, bloomed with faded flowers. The rug runner along the hall frayed at its edges, but still argued for elegance. Umbrellas leaned against a stand shaped like a swan. A velvet chair guarded the stairs as if appointed to greet arrivals and discourage regrets. Eleanor set her bags beside the chair and wandered room to room, opening curtains to let in the soft rain light. In the library, Aunt Matilda had called any room with more than 3 bookshelves a library. Even when it was also a dining room, Eleanor found the old desk with its glass paperweight, a swirl of blues that caught the window like a captured sky. Beneath the paperweight lay a note left by the solicitor, property deeds, an inventory list, a map of the grounds drawn by a surveyor with a fondness for tiny trees. There was also a small envelope in Aunt Matilda's fine looping hand, addressed to my dear Nell. Eleanor's breath wobbled. No one had called her that in years. She did not open it right away. Instead, she made tea in a kitchen that had collected kettles as if they were relatives, and she stood at the stove, watching the flame lilt under the iron, until the familiar clatter and steam felt like permission. She carried the mug back to the library and sat on the rug, back against the cool paneled wall. Only then did she slit the envelope with a butter knife and unfold the single sheet. "My dear Nell, if you are reading this, I have gone to fuss at the stars. Do not be cross with me for leaving you this dear, demanding place. It will boss you about and then apologize with carpets of blossom. You must allow it both traits. There is a garden you will hear about before you find it, because that is its way. No one truly owns it. We merely listen to what it asks and try, within our ordinary limits, to oblige. It likes to be cared for by people who love more than they admit. I think you might be such a person. The key to its gate is in the pantry, behind the second row of jars, and the tin painted with a goose wearing spectacles. It is a foolish tin, and yet it remembers better than I do where I put things. Tell the garden I said thank you. I hope you will find your own word for it. With you always, Matilda." Eleanor laughed, and the laugh was the sort that insists on being accompanied by tears. "All right," she said, wiping her face with Aunt Matilda's monogrammed handkerchief, left helpful on the desk. "All right, Aunt." "Show me then." The pantry smelled of nutmeg and old thyme. Rows of jars watched her like patient, worried eyes. She found the tin exactly where the letter said it would be, its lid a ridiculous goose peering over spectacles at a book. Inside lay a key not unlike the one for the front door, though older and freckled with rust. When she cupped it in her palm, the metal felt warmer than it should have, as if someone had just set it there. "Enchanted," she said aloud, trying the word as if it might bite. "We will see." The map's neat lines showed a walled enclosure, tucked behind an avenue of limes, and beyond a small meadow that the surveyor had labeled simply field, possibly orchard. Outside, the rain had collapsed into a mist that freckled her coat and curled her hair as she crossed the back lawn. The grass in the lawn had learned to pretend it was obedient. Beyond it, past a sagging iron bench and a lopsided armillary sphere, lay paths that had forgotten where they were going. Nettles claimed corners. A honeysuckle had married a downspout and was reluctant to divorce. She found the limes, by sound as much as by sight. Even in late season, their leaves whispered with a particular tenderness. The avenue had once been clipped and confident, but now it felt like the aisle of a wild cathedral, branches meeting overhead in a green arch. At the end of the aisle rose a wall of weathered brick, softened by moss. Ivy draped itself in elaborate phrases across the mortar, and berries glowed like small embers. Eleanor walked alongside the wall until she found a gate of black iron, delicate as lace and sturdy as a promise. Behind it, plants bunched against the bars as if curious. Someone had wrapped the lock long ago in an old scarf, faded to a washed gray. She touched the scarf, then the lock, which recognized the key in a way that made her stomach flicker with something like awe. The key turned with a scraping cough, and the gate opened onto the smell of damp earth and leaf mold, a scent that lives in the spine like memory. She stood on the threshold and let her eyes adjust. The garden had been busy in its neglect. Brambles frothed along the walls, and then, having reached them, fell back as if surprised by their own audacity. A yew pressed itself into a corner, with the air of something patient and disapproving. Tall grasses bowed and rose, bowing and rising again, as the mist threaded their blades. Statues lurked where someone had left them, a nymph smiling at her own chipped shoulder, a stag who had been startled for so many years that his surprise had become serenity. But beneath the tangle lay a shape. Paths, though disguised, revealed themselves as lighter scars in the green. Beds held their curves like sleeping cats. A round pond occupied the center. A dark coin with a film of leaves floating like small boats on its surface. At its edge, a cluster of irises had stayed brave with fans of sordid green. Eleanor walked along the nearest path and felt the old bricks underfoot, uneven and earnest. She spoke without intending to. "Hello," she said to the brambles and the pond and the statues and the wall. "I am Eleanor. I know very little, and I am willing to learn." A robin answered first. It appeared on the broken arm of the stone nymph with the aggrieved swagger of robins everywhere, and tilted its head as if to ask what she proposed. Then a breeze pressed across the garden, bringing with it the sharp sweetness of sage and the ghost of roses. Roses. Eleanor turned. The few bushes she could see were leggy and sullen, their canes arched like unstrung bows. Yet under an extravagance of thorn, she saw a warmth of color. She knelt and parted the branches gently. There, tucked where no eye could praise it, a single bloom unfurled, soft apricot shading to cream, too perfect for the time of year and too defiant not to be deliberate. "All right," she whispered. "That is a trick." The robin laughed in the way of robins, which is to say, it made a sound that admitted no responsibility. She walked the circuit once more, and then sat on the low lip of the pond, careful of her coat. The map had shown an old pump house beyond the western wall. Perhaps water could be coaxed to flow again. Perhaps the rill that cut through the central path could be persuaded to speak. She pictured shears, and saws and gloves, the first careful cuts that rescue rather than punish. She pictured laying a hand on the sun-warmed brick come summer and letting it give back what it had kept. The work felt large and oddly intimate. She felt, for the first time since unlocking the front door, not overwhelmed but invited. "You need help," she told the garden. "So do I." Back in the village, the grocer sold eggs as if each were newsworthy and knew every story, whether you wanted it or not. When Eleanor ducked into the shop later that afternoon, still damp around the edges and with mud on one knee, Mrs. Marchant greeted her with the mix of caution and curiosity, reserved for new arrivals and rare mushrooms. "You will be the Hart girl," Mrs. Marchant announced, as if Eleanor might deny it. "Matilda's great niece." "Yes," Eleanor said, and found that the fact pleased her in a quiet, large way. "I am Eleanor." "You have her hands," Mrs. Marchant said decisively, bagging potatoes with missionary zeal. Matilda had gardener's hands, even when she was baking. Always smelled of rosemary, that one. "And cinnamon. You will take tea tomorrow?" "I will," Eleanor said, because the invitation had been a command, but also because tea sounded like the right kind of kindness. "I found the walled garden." Mrs. Marchant's eyebrows climbed without hurry. "Did you now?" "The key was behind a tin with a goose wearing spectacles," Eleanor said, which seemed a necessary credential. Mrs. Marchant made a small sound that might have been laughter or memory. A foolish tin, that one. "Mind, you will want someone who understands the place. A job like that needs patience and imagination. We used to have a gardener who could coax daisies out of gravel and charm wasps into minding their manners. Left years back." "Do you know anyone now?" Eleanor asked. She tried to sound casual and almost succeeded. "Someone who could help me restore it, gently." Mrs. Marchant tipped her head, searching a catalog only she could see. "There is Gabriel Linden," she said at last. "Lives on the far side of the common. Does work up at the old rectory and on the churchyard. Quiet as a fern. Knows when to leave things alone and when to talk to them." She added after a beat, "People say he knows that garden." "How could he?" Eleanor asked too quickly. "No one has been inside for years." Mrs. Marchant's mouth did a small, not unkind thing. "There are ways of knowing that do not depend on gates," she said. "He is particular. Does not take every job, but if the place wants him, he will hear it." She scribbled on the back of a receipt and pushed it across. "Here. The lane and the gate color. He dislikes telephones. Go with your boots on." Eleanor tucked the slip into her pocket and felt relief gather at the edges of her day, a school of small fish moving as one. The bell over the shop door rang as another customer entered, trailing a scarf the length of a story. Outside, the village wore its late season comfortably. The green had chosen a bench to lean on. Children in bright hats tried to feed biscuits to a bronze soldier who kept his composure. A dog decided it lived everywhere, and no one argued. Eleanor carried her bags to the car, then stood for a long moment with her hands wrapped around them, letting the ordinary settle on her shoulders like a shawl. She had loved the city for its noise and its ambition. She had taught herself to be decisive, to keep to a schedule, to choose furniture that folded. Yet here, with her boots damp, and her hair springing out of any arrangement, and a tin goose already playing a role in her afternoon, she felt a strand of herself she had not noticed tug toward alignment. Rain returned in a brief, considerate curtain as she pulled into the drive. She left the groceries in the kitchen and went looking for lamps. Evening had a habit of entering this house early, as if it liked the conversation. She lit one in the library, where the paperweight blue took on depth, and another on the small table under the stair, where a vase waited, without complaint, for flowers that were not yet ready to be found. She took Aunt Matilda's letter from her pocket and read it again at the desk, tracing the swirls with an absent finger. The letter had said the garden liked to be cared for by people who loved more than they admitted. Eleanor had made a habit of admitting very little beyond competence. Love had been something she practiced on tasks and on friends, carefully. She had not trusted it around her heart since a careless season years ago, when everything felt like bloom, and the frost had arrived without warning. In the glass of the window, the garden's dark bulk pressed against its wall. She could feel it there. Not a pressure exactly, but an awareness, like standing in the same room with a sleeping animal large enough to change the air. She brewed another cup of tea and took it upstairs to the bedroom that had known her only a handful of times on childhood visits. The quilt was a field of stitched violets. The bed had kept the shape of Aunt Matilda's reading habit. One side of the mattress ever so slightly more loyal to a particular dip. Under the pillow lay a sprig of lavender, dry but still fragrant, as if the room had arranged to greet her in its own way. Sleep came early, not out of exhaustion, but because the day had folded itself neatly. She dreamed of walls built out of green, of keys that hummed in her hand, of robins who complained kindly. Once she woke and could not tell if the pale patch on the ceiling was moon or memory. When she drifted off again, she imagined she heard water move. Morning arranged itself with the same patient light. The rain had gone, leaving every blade and branch glazed with the kind of shine that comes only after weather. Eleanor wrapped her hands around a mug and stood in the back doorway while the kettle breathed behind her. The lawn jeweled. The limes along the avenue shook themselves, like dogs with impeccable manners. She carried a basket of pruning shears, twine, and gloves down to the garden, telling herself she would only make a start, just enough to feel less like a trespasser. The gate did not resist her. The lock, having remembered again. The air inside smelled green and mineral, and a little like apples stored in a cellar. She began where she meant to end gently. She teased ivy from the first statue's face, revealing the nymph's tilted smile. She cut away a handful of dead canes from the roses, leaving as much as she took, and thanked them quietly for being more stubborn than neglect. She tugged a tuft of frost-burnt grass free from the pond's lip and watched a water spider sketch invisible cursive across the surface. It was when she paused to stretch that she noticed the light had changed. The day was fair, soft and gray, and yet a silver seeped along the edge of every leaf. Not quite sunlight, and not quite dew. It lingered, as if moonlight had forgotten to leave. Eleanor held still. The robin landed near her boot and tilted its head in the universal sign for, well, pay attention then. Somewhere beyond the wall, a bell rang once, Not a church bell, but something smaller, like the sound a spoon makes in a particular kind of cup. "All right," she said to the garden. "I believe you are capable of tricks. I would prefer we made an agreement. You keep the tricks mostly gentle, and I will learn to notice when they are not." A small gust answered. It smelled, somehow, of roses brought in from rain, of old stone warmed, of letters read aloud. By late morning, Eleanor had a pile of cuttings, and the satisfying ache that comes from work that expects nothing more than presents. She brushed soil from her knees, locked the gate behind her, and followed the lane Mrs. Marchant had described. Past the moss-slick milestone, under the hawthorn that kept the ditch secret, and then the narrow track that turned toward a copse in which a cottage considered whether it wanted to be seen. The gate was the color of lichen, an exact green that held a memory of blue. It did not creak when she pushed it, because someone had loved its hinges. The garden beyond it was not showy. It was the sort a person makes to please the hours. Herbs in well-shaped squares, a pear trained along a wall, a bench in the only place a bench belongs. The door stood open. Eleanor hesitated on the step and then knocked on the frame rather than the wood, not wanting to startle whatever peace lived here. A man's voice answered from somewhere near the back, low and even. "One moment." He appeared, wiping his hands on a cloth. He wore a shirt the color of unbleached linen and trousers that looked like they did not mind a kneel. His hair was dark with a scatter of early gray at the temples, the kind that looks like a decision made by the seasons, and not by worry. His eyes did not startle. They took things in the way a garden takes rain. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," Eleanor returned. "I am Eleanor Hart. I have inherited Hart House, my great-aunt Matilda's. I was told you might be the person to ask about a garden that could use both patience and imagination." Something that might have been recognition passed through his gaze and changed nothing about his calm. "I am Gabriel Linden," he said. "I do both when the place asks for it." Eleanor, who had not intended to mention keys or robins or moonlit leaves, heard herself say anyway, "I have a walled garden that blooms when it should not and sulks when praised. It smells like memory and listens at doors. People in the village say it is enchanted. I am not inclined toward enchantment, and yet, he finished softly, as if the phrase were a path they had both found from opposite directions. They stood in the doorway, with the low sun at their shoulders and the faint chime of some distant wind bell threading the pause. Eleanor felt, unmistakably, the same tug she had felt at the iron gate and at the pond, and when she first read Aunt Matilda's letter. The sense that she had arrived at the beginning of a sentence the world had been writing for years. "Will you come and look?" she asked, aware of how much she was asking, and trying to ask it in a way that left room for refusal. "I will come," he said, and the words sounded less like a promise than like a truth acknowledging its next step. "If the garden wants me, it will let me in. It already has opinions about keys," Eleanor said, and he smiled, not absent-mindedly, but with attention. "I have found that the most stubborn gates open for the right questions," he said. "Shall we see what it answers today. They walked back along the lane, boots whispering against the grit, talking not at all. It did not feel like silence, so much as the kind of listening that arrives when two people have agreed, without saying so, that words ought to be used carefully. At the wall, Eleanor pressed the key into the lock. Gabriel did not watch her hands, which felt like a kindness. He looked at the brick, at the ivy, at the small places where moss chose to be. When the gate swung, the robin flew from the nymph's shoulder to the thorny crown of a rose, and considered them both as if taking attendance. Gabriel stepped through and inhaled with a sort of relief. "Ah," he said simply, as if greeting an old friend and a weather front. He knelt to press his palm to the path's bricks, and Eleanor, without meaning to, held her breath. "It remembers kindness," he said at last, looking up at her. His eyes were a gray that had learned green, or perhaps green that had learned gray. "It remembers your aunt. It will learn you if you want it to." "I do," she said, and felt the truth of it settle in her chest like the first warm stone on a winter night. Gabriel rose. The silver along the leaf edges deepened for a heartbeat, then softened again, as if the garden had smiled and not shown its teeth. The robin scolded nobody and everyone. Somewhere beyond the pond, a cluster of snowdrops that had no business being awake lifted their lamps. "I will help," Gabriel said. "We will not hurry." The garden wants a partner, not a manager. Eleanor looked at the wild paths, the sulking roses, the patient yew. She looked at Gabriel, whose presence felt like a steady hand waiting without pressure. She looked finally at the part of herself that had arrived with lists and found she had room for other things. "All right," she said, and the words were not surrender, but invitation. Let us begin. Chapter 2. The Awakening. The next morning broke pale and clear. The sky rinsed of clouds until it looked almost translucent. Frost feathered the corners of the window panes, delicate as lace, and Eleanor rose with a kind of anticipation that had little to do with chores and everything to do with the key that now rested in the pocket of her coat. She had gone to sleep, hearing the garden in her mind, the rustle of bramble, the faint perfume of impossible roses, the sigh of water she was sure had moved, though no rill had flowed. By the time she reached the back steps, Gabriel Linden was already there, leaning against the iron railing as though he belonged to it. He had brought with him a canvas satchel slung over one shoulder, a pair of worn leather gloves tucked in his belt, and an air of quiet readiness that reminded Eleanor of old trees, steady, unhurried, and wholly present. "Good morning," he said. She smiled, surprising herself with the ease of it. "You are early." "The garden asked for me sooner than later," he replied, as though that were the most ordinary of explanations. They walked together down the avenue of limes, their boots scattering frost from the path. At the gate, Eleanor produced the heavy key and turned it in the lock. The iron yielded with its usual sigh. Gabriel stepped inside first, pausing with his hand lightly against the old brick as if to ask permission. "The bones are good," he said after a moment. "Paths intact, walls strong. It has not given up. That is the most important part." Eleanor followed, hugging her coat closer. It looks more like surrender than survival. Not surrender, Gabriel murmured, crouching to brush leaves from a patch of earth, resting, waiting for someone to notice. He pressed his palm to the soil and closed his eyes briefly, then straightened. It is ready. They began with the brambles. Eleanor tugged on her gloves and set to work beside him, clipping carefully where thorns had strangled roses, pulling vines from corners that had become too greedy. Gabriel moved with an economy of effort, each cut deliberate, each pull measured, as though he was conversing with the plants rather than correcting them, carefully where thorns had strangled roses, pulling vines from corners that had become too greedy. Gabriel moved with an economy of effort, each cut deliberate, each pull measured, as though he was conversing with the plants rather than correcting them. "Do you always work this way?" she asked, pausing to wipe her brow. He looked up, eyes crinkling faintly at the edges. There is no hurry. Growth knows its pace. I listen, then answer. That is all. It struck her how different that was from her own life, the city deadlines, the emails, the perpetual pressure to prove competence. Here, among leaves and silence, the work asked nothing more than patience and presence. By midday, they had uncovered the curve of a path long hidden. The bricks beneath were moss-soft, but intact, forming a gentle spiral that led toward the pond at the center. When Gabriel brushed the last of the debris away, Eleanor drew in a sharp breath. "It looks like it was meant to guide someone inward," she whispered. "Most gardens are journeys disguised as spaces," he said. They sat on the low stone edge of the pond to eat the bread and cheese Eleanor had packed. The water mirrored the pale sky, though faint ripples moved where no wind touched. As she watched, a shape rose from the depths, a single lily pad, followed by another, unfurling as though coaxed awake. "It is winter," Eleanor murmured, leaning closer. "They should not." Gabriel only nodded. The garden has its own seasons. A stillness settled between them, companionable and charged all at once. Eleanor found herself watching the curve of his hands as he broke bread, the calm way he chewed, the ease with which he belonged here. She wondered how many other gardens had bent toward him like this one, how many secrets he carried from soil to soil. When they returned to work, the air itself seemed to shift. The brambles yielded more easily. The roses lifted their thorny arms as if grateful. By the time dusk stretched its violet shawl across the sky, they had uncovered nearly half the original beds. In one, beneath a tangle of weeds, a patch of violets bloomed shyly, tiny faces tilted toward her in defiance of the season. Eleanor knelt, fingertips brushing the petals. "How is this possible?" Gabriel's voice came quietly at her shoulder. "The garden remembers love. It answers when it feels it near." Her breath caught. She wanted to ask what he meant, but the words tangled in her throat. Instead, she looked at the violets, at their improbable persistence, and felt something stir in her chest that she had long trained into silence. They locked the gate at last and walked back along the lime avenue in the deepening twilight. Lanterns glowed in the windows of the house, and the air smelled of wood smoke and promise. At the back steps, Gabriel paused. Tomorrow I will bring seedlings. Not to replace what is here only, to remind it of company. You speak as if it listens, Eleanor said, half teasing. His eyes met hers steadily. It does. She did not argue. She only nodded, feeling the strange warmth of certainty in his voice linger long. After he disappeared down the lane, that night, Eleanor dreamed of the garden alive with impossible colors, roses climbing the walls in, cascades of light, lilies unfolding under a silver moon, violets weaving carpets beneath her feet. And always, beside her in the dream, walked a man whose presence steadied the ground itself. When she woke, her pillow smelled faintly of roses that should not have been blooming at all. Chapter 3. Blooming Hearts. Morning arrived tasting of frost and citrus. Eleanor stepped onto the back step with her hands wrapped around a mug and found the air still as if the world were taking a long, luxurious breath. Before speaking, the avenue of limes glittered faintly. Leaves that had fallen in the night wore silver edges, and the grass was embroidered with a lace of ice so fine it seemed the lawn had dressed itself for a secret ceremony. Gabriel came along the lane, with the grounds quiet under his feet and a flat wooden tray balanced. On one palm, seedlings dotted the tray in small earthen pots, each a pocket of hopeful green. A tangle of twine rode his wrist like a bracelet. He tipped his head in greeting. I brought a chorus rather than a solo, he said. Sometimes the shy ones sing better together. Eleanor smiled. What have you brought? Wallflowers who remember how to be brave, he said. Sweet rocket that likes to pretend it is. Moonlight. A drift of violets in case their cousins want company, and a handful of foxgloves that believe good manners and drama can be the same thing. Perfect, she murmured, and meant it. They walked side by side through the lime avenue. The robins had already begun their patrol, serious about the business of being small and important. At the gate, Eleanor slid the key into the lock and felt again the soft, secret welcome in the metal, something warmer than mechanics, as if the key recognized her hand as much as the gate recognized the key. Inside, the garden breathed them in. A faint mist lay low to the ground and along the margin of the path she could see, with a thrill she did not bother to disguise, that the lily pads had multiplied in the night, coin upon coin, a green constellation. Good morning, Eleanor said. To everything and nothing, we have brought friends. Gabriel placed the tray on the low wall near the pond and opened his satchel. The tools gleamed with the dull shine of purpose. He lifted one and then paused, fingertips resting lightly on the handle. Before we begin, he said, tone ordinary, but eyes steady, there is a thing I ought to tell you. Not because it changes the work, but because work is always better with truth under it. She stilled, the garden's hush gathering between them like a shawl. "I knew your great aunt," he said, and the simple confession held a tenderness that made Eleanor's throat tighten. Not as a young man, later. I had been hired to see to the churchyard, and she found me at the market arguing with a flat of time that wanted to be something else. She told me the time was right and I was wrong and invited me to tea to explain why. I ended up staying all afternoon. After that, I came when the garden asked and when she asked, which was much the same thing. Eleanor laughed, helpless and loving. That sounds like her. She liked to pretend the place belonged to her, Gabriel went on, but she knew better. She kept watch. She listened. She did not pry. She told me once that her task was to be the best human the garden had had so far, and to leave it a little more itself for whoever came next. He glanced at Eleanor, not away, but not pressing. She believed you were that person. The words landed with the soft weight of a hand on a shoulder. Eleanor looked down at the bricks beneath her boots, old red peeking through moss, and felt a warmth she had not expected or asked for uncurl in her chest. Gratitude, certainly. Fear, a little. And behind both, a sense of belonging that did not require justification. "I wish I had come sooner," she said softly. "I kept telling myself there would be time. There wasn't. Time behaves for no one," Gabriel said. "You are here. She knew you would come when you could bear to." A small bell chimed from somewhere beyond the wall. One pure note that sounded like memory learning to be music. The robin hopped onto the rim of the seedling tray and inspected the foxgloves with the air of a foreman checking a delivery. Gabriel's gaze followed the bird, humor gentling his mouth. "We have the manager's approval," he said. "Let us begin." They worked until the pale light climbed the brick and warmed the moss enough to release its scent, that green private fragrance that exists somewhere between earth and rain. Gabriel showed Eleanor how to loosen roots without breaking them, how to settle a plant as if tucking a child in for sleep. He asked the soil questions she could not hear and seemed to understand its answers. When she fretted over the angle of a stem, he said, "Trust the lean." Plants remember where they mean to look, and the stem, obedient to his confidence, arranged itself. Between tasks, the talk was light at first. Names of varieties, the temperaments of herbs, which beds wanted shade, and which wanted the honest blaze of afternoon. Yet the more they worked, the more other things crept in, as if the garden had opened a gate that had nothing to do with iron. I left the city because I was tired of being tidy with things that will not stay tidy, Eleanor heard herself say, and blinked at her own boldness. Grief, mostly. It does not care about calendars. No, Gabriel said. He sat back on his heels, hands on his thighs, and let the word be what it was. It cares about seasons, and even then it refuses to be told the weather. I tried to order mine once. It grew wilder to spite me. In the end, I found it a place to live, where wildness was not an insult. The garden, she guessed. Yes, he said simply. And the work. Work is a kind of faith. They paused to eat on the low wall again. Apples that snapped like small songs, buttered oatcakes, a slice of cheese with an honesty to it. Birds moved through the hawthorn, beyond the gate in a wheeling whisper. Eleanor's shoulders had the good ache of used muscles, and her mind had the even better ease that comes when it stops thinking it is in charge. "Did you ever wonder," she said, later brushing soil from her palms, "if the stories about this place were only stories? Lovely, persistent, not untrue, but not fact." Gabriel considered. "Stories are facts that refuse to be measured," he said. "I have learned to trust things that cannot be counted. When I do, the counted things behave themselves by following." He straightened and showed her a trick with a twine that tucked a rose cane into a curve instead of a command. The cane seemed to relax under his hands, and a fragrance lifted from it that should not have belonged to this month, an aroma of summer kept like a secret in the canes. Eleanor breathed it in, eyes closing, and for an instant she felt a pressure at her back, like the memory of a hand, Aunt Matilda's perhaps, or perhaps the place itself, composed of all the hands that had attended it, a chorus of steadiness. In the early afternoon, they sought the small building beyond the western wall. The map had called it a pump house, and it had the square, stubborn charm of structures that have done one job well and intend to keep doing it. The door groaned because doors enjoy a performance, and the air inside hummed faintly of iron and old water. Dust lay like velvet along the shelves. On one wall hung a row of tools, each shaped by use, to fit a particular grip that remembered the person who had held it. Eleanor set her fingers reverently on the largest handle. "This was my great-aunt's," she said, certain, though she had no proof but her bones. Gabriel crouched by the pump and tested a valve with the gentle tension he gave all things that had donated themselves to time. "It is not broken," he said. "It is asleep. Can we wake it?" she asked. "We can ask politely," he said, warmth in the words, "and we can clear the channel that wants to carry its voice." Together they followed the old rill that snaked along the path, a dry ribbon edged with the stones darkened by memory. Leaves filled it, and a generation of twigs, and one or two charming pebbles that had been placed by hands that could not help placing them. They lifted, sorted, set aside. When they reached a shallow basin near the pond, Gabriel reached into the silt and found the mouth of a pipe, clogged but not resentful. "If the garden answers," he said, "we will know by evening." They restored the last of the seedlings, anchored a small trellis, with care where a wallflower looked as if it might enjoy climbing, and stood side by side to examine the day's work. The space had shifted while they labored. Paths had widened, not because they were larger, but because they had remembered their shape. The yew in the corner, having observed them with suspicion all morning, now looked merely dignified. "Thank you," Eleanor said, to the man beside her, to the garden, to the woman who had written letters in a looping hand and tucked a lavender sprig beneath a pillow years before. The word rose from her as naturally as breath. The garden seemed to take it in. They locked the gate at last and walked back to the house. At the back step, Gabriel paused, not with reluctance, but with the sense of a sentence that knows there is more to say and chooses to stop anyway, acknowledging the pleasure of punctuation, "I will come in the evening," he said, as if telling her what the weather intended, "if you want that." "Come," she said. "There is tea, and I think the place may try a trick." He smiled. "Then we will let it." After he had gone, Eleanor took a quick shower that was more about steam and clearing her thoughts than anything to do with soap. She dressed in a sweater the color of lichen and pulled her hair back with a ribbon Aunt Matilda had tied on a book once, as if a ribbon knew how to attach a story to a moment. In the kitchen, she stirred honey into a pot and sliced lemons, thin enough to see light through. The kettle, being a friend, began to murmur before she asked. When evening arrived, it brought the kind of twilight that makes its own light. The sky was lavender and pewter both. The rills of the roof clicked as the day settled. A first star shouldered its way into the visible world above the west field. Gabriel came with that same quiet footfall, and with him came a flask that smelled faintly of mint and something warmer. He held it out for later, he said, in case the air becomes a chorus. They carried their cups and a blanket down the lime avenue, past the armillary sphere that had decided not to take itself so seriously, and opened the gate. The garden greeted them with a cool, expectant hush. Nightbirds had begun their careful calls, that soft punctuation nature uses when it wants to talk and not be overheard. They settled on the low wall by the pond. The surface of the water held the sky like a second sky. The seedling tray sat empty now, its little bowls tucked into earth. Somewhere beyond the beds, a hedgehog made delicate negotiations with a pile of leaves. A mild wind moved. It felt like breath against the face. Then, almost too quietly to notice, the water in the rill shivered. Eleanor leaned forward, cup balanced between her palms. The shiver became a slip, then a thread, then the faintest of songs, not the splash of drama, but the silver talk of water, glad to remember itself. It slid from the pump house mouth, beneath the wall, ran along the path's edge in a line, thin as ribbon, and gathered into the small basin with a sound like spoons in a drawer. When the first trickle spilled over the basin's lip, the lily pads trembled as if something had passed beneath them that belonged to them. Eleanor laughed, and the laugh was not tidy. It broke and mended in the same breath. "You were right," she whispered. "Asking works better than telling." The garden answered by shifting the light. Moon had not yet lifted above the wall, but a silver rose began along the edges of leaves as if night were rehearsing itself early. The blooms that should not have existed stole scent into the air. The violets made a modest glow by being exactly themselves. Gabriel poured a thumb of the mint-sweet liquid into each cup and topped it with tea. "For warmth," he said, and when their fingers brushed, it did not feel like accident or destiny. It felt like courtesy becoming courage. They drank, and the drink did what good drinks do. Put a little fire where it was wanted, and a little hush where noise had been. For a time, they spoke only to point out small, impossible things, the way a spider had made a bridge between iris leaves that could not be close enough the day before, the single petals sailing like a tiny boat across the pond, the exact shade of shadow where the yew guarded its corner. Eleanor set her cup down and folded the blanket over her knees. The words that had been gathering all day arranged themselves into something like a sentence. "I am afraid," she said, because the garden had been honest, and she wanted to be too. Not of work. I can work. Not of the size of this place. Large things are only a lot of small things wearing the same jacket. I am afraid of color. Gabriel did not laugh at her strange truth. Color? In my heart, she said. I have kept it in whites and grays for a long time. They are easier to clean. They do not demand attention. But since I stepped into this place, I keep seeing oranges and greens and that particular blue that only happens just before morning. I want them, and I am afraid of wanting. He was quiet for a long moment. The water talked to itself prettily. There was a time, he said finally, when I decided wanting was a thing I would not do again. I had wanted foolishly. I had wanted a life that belonged to someone else because it was neat. Then the wanting broke, as neat things do when they are not ours. I walked into a garden like this and found I could not keep color away either. I learned to want correctly, not from hunger, from health. What does wanting correctly feel like? She asked, voice barely larger than the night between them. Like standing in a room and knowing which window to open, he said, and not apologizing when you do. They sat with that. The moon, practical at last, shouldered up above the wall, and the silver they had been tricked by earlier was replaced by the honest kind. It lay along the pond and made a clean coin of it. It turned bramble tips into ink strokes. It gilded the edges of Gabriel's profile and made of him a drawing that knew how to move. Eleanor thought of Aunt Matilda writing, "Tell the garden I said thank you," and decided the best way to say it would be to stop arguing with the gifts she was given. She turned to Gabriel, heart in her mouth and not hurrying, because courage is slower than fear, and that is one of its virtues. You speak of wanting, she said. I would like to be brave enough to say that I want you to stay. Not just for today, not only as a gardener, as the person you are when you are here. I do not know how to do this anymore. The part where two people risk something together. I am likely to knock over the first face I walk past. Gabriel's eyes, which had always been steady, became tender without losing steadiness. He set his cup down, not to dramatize, but to keep from spilling. I want to stay, he said simply. I have wanted it since I watched you touch the first rose cane, like a thing you had no right to and every right to. I do not want to hurry you. I want to be allowed to stand where you can see me, and to be useful and to tell the truth when it is kind, and to be quiet when that is kinder. Her breath came in and stayed a breath and then eased out. The garden did not erupt. It did not clap. It did something better. It brought forth a scent, like orange peel, warmed in a pocket, like new bread near a window, like the page of a book that has waited exactly long enough to be turned. Somewhere, impossibly, roses loosened more petals into bloom. Eleanor's hand had placed itself beside her on the stone. Gabrielle's found it. Their fingers did not clasp. They rested side by side, an agreement made without a ceremony. The world, noticing but not intruding, continued as it had planned, water murmuring, a small wing in the hedge, the moon doing its crystal work. Your great aunt once told me, Gabriel said after a while, that the garden answers not to grand declarations, but to small consistencies. She said, I thank it every time. It does what gardens do, which is to keep going, I have found she was right about most things. She usually was, Eleanor said, and laughed softly, for the sheer mercy of being allowed to say was without being undone by it. The laugh turned into something like a tear at its edges, but the tear did not fall. It sat on the shelf of her lower lashes, and Manners kept it there. Then let us keep going, Gabriel said. Not to a finish. To a beginning that knows how to last. They did not kiss, not that night. It would have been easy to, with the moon helping and the scent of unreasonable flowers, and the pond pretending to be a mirror for every wish. But something in both of them seemed to understand that beginnings built to last do not need to be announced in trumpet and silk. They need to be agreed upon in breath and presence. They need a place to stand. They stayed until the mint warmth in their cups had cooled and the first suggestion of owl talk threaded the hedge. When they rose, it was with the unshowy choreography of people who have decided to carry the same small weight together. They folded the blanket, checked the gate, walked the lime avenue with a slowness that had nothing to do with fatigue. At the back steps, Eleanor turned and looked. The garden lay behind the wall, not hidden exactly, not displayed. She felt it the way one feels a sleeping house, its rooms gathered around a center that remembers laughter. She bowed her head, not much, just enough. "Thank you," she said. The words pointed toward brick and ivy and water, and the person beside her, and the woman who had left lavender under pillows, and the self who had driven through rain to a place she thought would be only roofs and repairs, and had become a lesson in the restorative properties of attention. Gabriel touched the railing the same way he had touched the wall, palm flat, fingers honest. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she echoed. She slept with the window cracked to let the garden in. At some small hour, she woke to the quietest sound of water and the faintest impression that the moon had come close to look at her more carefully and then had been satisfied. Days arranged themselves after that with a generosity that felt like luck and was, Eleanor suspected, something sturdier. In the mornings, they worked, cutting with care, tying, mulching, setting new things where old ones had asked for partners. In the afternoons, they met Mrs. Marchant for tea that tasted like gossip and comfort. And it turned out the grocer had opinions about compost that would shame most professors. In the evenings, they returned to the wall and the gate, confident in the ease that had begun to live in their bones. Word spread quietly through the village that Matilda Hart's walled garden had woken. Children peered through cracks in the brick with the reverence only children and poets know how to muster. A man with a camera asked if he might take a picture from the lime avenue. Eleanor said, only if he did not promise the world anything it could not keep. He promised pictures and no pronouncements. She let him in. On a morning when frost scalloped the pond and the sun made a thin gold wire along the tops of the walls, Eleanor found in the pump house a small book tucked behind a shelf, pages bound in worn leather, its strap soft with long use. She opened it carefully. Inside, Aunt Matilda's hand marched across the paper in its cheerful loops. Dates ambled along margins, names of plants, sketches of leaves. Between the lists and drawings were short sentences that read like prayers written by someone with earthy hands. Today the garden forgave my impatience. Today I told the wall my favorite secret, and it kept it. Today the water remembered where it was going. Toward the back, a page carried 2 signatures, Matilda's, and beneath it, in a quieter hand, G. Linden. Eleanor pressed her fingers to the ink, not quite touching. Gabriel, when she showed him, bowed his head over the book with a humility that made her love him a little without being frightened by the word. Not yet said, not yet asked of him, but present. Your aunt called this her ledger of conversations, he said. She told me to write only when I had listened properly. She will not mind if we keep it, Eleanor asked, half smiling at asking permission of someone gone. She will insist on it, he said, and found a pencil that had been left to be found. Eleanor thought for a moment, then wrote with deliberate care, Today the garden taught me how to want color without apology. She handed the pencil to Gabriel. He considered, eyes on the pond through the pump house doorway, then bent and wrote on the next line, Today the garden told me to stay. She did not cry, though the sentence asked for tears. She kissed his temple instead, the briefest touch, a benediction given and received. He closed his eyes and leaned into it, as if blessing were a language he understood best when it was quiet. By the time winter began to fold itself into the thought of spring, the beds held their curves again. The paths had remembered how to be paths, and the pond spoke each evening as if it preferred to recount the day to itself, rather than to forget it. The gate still asked for the key, and gave it back in satisfaction. The robin promoted itself to supervisor and had hired a wren. Eleanor and Gabriel moved through all of it with a kind of ease that makes onlookers believe nothing had been difficult. Between them, small consistencies multiplied. A hand outstretched without ceremony when a boot slipped on damp brick. A thermos passed back and forth with the exact right amount of tea left. A weight lifted together, because together was sensible. When finally they kissed, it was in daylight, with the yew looking on like a tolerant aunt, and the violets approving by being exactly themselves. It did not make a sound. It did not need to. The garden wrote their names in scent for a minute, and then let the air take it, because sweetness is better shared than hoarded. In the ledger that evening, Eleanor wrote, Today the garden decided we were a sentence worth finishing. Gabriel added beneath it, Today I believed in something that could bear being believed in. They closed the book gently. Eleanor slipped a sprig of lavender between its last pages, not to press the past, but to perfume what came next. And if, when the moon rose full, the lilies flared white in a month, when lilies have no business lifting their faces, and if the wall caught those faces and sent them back softer, and if the water sang a little louder, as if practicing for some spring performance, and if a bell far away chimed that spoon on china note, when no one's hand had lifted a spoon, and if Eleanor and Gabriel, standing with fingers loosely intertwined by the pond, did not question any of it, well, that was between the garden and those who kept it company. Because some places cannot be found on any map. They are made slowly, consistently, by attention and tenderness, by hands that know how to carry shovels and secrets, by hearts that risk color after long seasons of white. And when love comes to such places, It does not need to announce itself. It only needs to bloom. Eleanor looked at Gabriel, and the garden lifted its breath in contentment. Aunt Matilda, somewhere busy with the stars, approved in a way only gardens and ants know how to express. The robin permitted an extra crumb from a pocket. The foxgloves rehearsed their summer speeches in green. "Tomorrow," Gabriel said, as he always did. "Tomorrow," Eleanor answered, and felt how large and kind the word could be when spoken where things are invited to grow. Thank you for listening to Moonlit Romantic. In Eleanor's hands, the garden woke again, a place of secrets, of patience and of love that bloomed quietly, like violets after frost. If the Enchanted Garden touched your heart tonight, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes that love, like roses, can return in its own season. Until we meet again, rest easy, dream deeply, and remember, some gardens grow flowers, but the rare ones grow love.